I'm Mark Bruzonsky, your host for Mideast Realities. Edward Said is one of the most profound thinkers, writers, and commentators of our time. One of the most influential humanists of our generation is how he is introduced in just a few moments. He also happens to be Palestinian. Born in Jerusalem, Said's family fled to Cairo when the civil war between Jews and Arabs broke out in British Mandate Palestine after World War II. Then, as a boy, he came to the United States. Said is one of the best-known professors at Columbia University, where he holds a distinguished and endowed chair in English comparative literature. As you will hear in the upcoming introduction, he has held nearly every major fellowship known to man or beast, and has delivered some 27 endowed lectures. Said is in demand throughout the world at major universities, not only in the field of literature, but as a social critic and political analyst. Though in his early years at Columbia, Said was not greatly politically involved, he became more and more so in the 70s and 80s. He was, in fact, a prominent member of the Palestine National Council during the time when the PLO was most ostracized and vilified in the U.S. In recent years, especially since the Gulf War and the agreements that followed between Israel and what was the PLO, Edward Said has become one of the most outspoken dissenters from and critics of U.S. foreign policy, Yasser Arafat, and developments in the Middle East region. Said's books and articles have been widely published throughout the world in many languages. Orientalism, published in 1978, is considered a defining treatise on the subject of Western cultural and social imperialism. In this series of 4 Mideast Realities programs, we are very pleased to be able to bring you one of Edward Said's most interesting and provocative recent lectures. The title of the lecture is The Clash of Civilizations, and Said delivered it at the University of Wisconsin in Madison in November of '95. What Said discusses is, of course, much broader than just contemporary Middle East events. But what he discusses is actually of considerable importance in providing the vital background necessary to really appreciate these events and put them in historical perspective. And during the lecture, and even more so in the question and answer period, Said specifically comments about Israeli-Palestinian developments in the past few years, comments that are of extreme importance and should be very carefully pondered.
It's quite easy to see how, for instance, the practice of Japan bashing in the West can be fueled by appeals to the menacing and sinister aspects of Japanese culture as employed by government spokespersons, or how the age-old appeal to the yellow peril might be mobilized for use in discussions in Washington or New York or London of ongoing problems with Korea, North and South Korea, or China. The opposite is true, but it is true, in the practice throughout Asia and Africa of Occidentalism, in other words, talking about the West as if it was one thing and one thing only, turning the West into a monolithic category that is supposed to express hostility to non-white, non-European, and non-Christian civilizations. Perhaps because he's more interested in policy prescription than he is either in history or the careful analysis of cultural formations, Huntington, in my opinion, is quite misleading in what he says and how he puts things. A great deal of his, and the reason one takes time with him at all, I mean, it's a 17-page document, but it's very influential, and B, he does represent a kind of important sector of opinion in this country, and I think in that respect he's symptomatic and therefore worth a good deal of attention. A great deal of his argument depends on, not on direct contact with and understanding and knowledge of languages of, but rather second and third hand opinion that really scants the enormous advances in our concrete and theoretical understanding of how cultures work, how they change, how they are. Cultures are not simply, like, an inert object, but they're dynamic, constantly changing things. And we know now a great deal more about how they work and how they can be grasped and apprehended. A brief look at the people and opinions he quotes suggests that rather than scholarship or theory about cultures, his main sources are journalism and popular demagoguery. When you draw on tendentious publicists, scholars and journalists like Charles Krauthammer, who's cited as an authority on world civilization, or Bernard Lewis, who's cited it doesn't really matter what he's cited as an authority on. You already, in my opinion, prejudice the argument in favor of conflict and polemic rather than in favor of true understanding and the kind of cooperation between peoples that our planet needs. Huntington's authorities are not the cultures themselves, therefore, but a small handful of authorities, or pseudo-authorities, picked by him because, in fact, they emphasize the latent belligerency in one or another statement by one or another so-called spokesman for about that culture. The giveaway for me is the title of his essay, which nobody has commented on, I think, The Clash of Civilizations, which is not his phrase, but Bernard Lewis's phrase. On the last page of Lewis's essay entitled The Roots of Muslim Rage, and Muslims are always talked about in terms of rage and madness and insecurity and all these other things. An article that appeared in the Atlantic Monthly in September of 1990, Lewis speaks about his diagnosis of the current problem of the Islamic world. I quote, "It should by now be clear that we are facing a mood and a movement in Islam, that is, far transcending the level of issues and policies and the governments that pursue them." In other words, we're really not talking about the real world at all. This is no less than a clash of civilizations. The perhaps irrational but surely historic reactions of an ancient rival against our Judeo-Christian heritage, our secular present, and the worldwide expansion of both. It is crucially important that we, on our side, should not be provoked into an equally historic but also equally irrational reaction against that rival. Now, I don't want to spend too much time discussing the lamentable features of Lewis's article. I've described his methods elsewhere, the lazy generalizations, the reckless distortions of history, the wholesale demotion of civilizations into categories like irrational, enraged, so on and so forth. Few people today with any sense would want to volunteer such sweeping characterizations as the one advanced by Lewis about 1 billion Muslims, whom he calls irrational and enraged. Muslims who are scattered through at least 5 continents, dozens of different languages and traditions, as well as histories. Of them all, he says that they're all enraged at Western modernity, as if 1 billion people were only one person sitting in a chair opposite Lewis, sort of frothing at the mouth. And Western civilization itself was no more complicated a matter than a simple declarative sentence. But what I do want to stress is, first of all, how Huntington has picked up from Lewis the notion that civilizations are monolithic and homogeneous. And second, again from Lewis, how he assumes the unchanging character of the duality between us and them. In other words, I think it's absolutely imperative to stress that, like Bernard Lewis, Huntington does not write neutral, descriptive, objective prose, but is himself a polemicist whose rhetoric not only depends heavily on prior arguments about a war of all against all, but in effect perpetuates the war. Far from being an arbiter between civilizations, therefore, such people as Huntington are partisans, advocates of one civilization over all the others. Like Lewis, Huntington defines Islamic civilization reductively, as if what most matters about it is its supposed anti-Westernism, as if every Muslim in the world wakes up every morning and feels very anti-Western. You can see how ridiculous this is, but this is language that is taken seriously. People puff on their pipes, they nod their heads, they get foundation grants, they write books. There's a... For his part, Lewis tries to give a set of reasons for his definition, that Islam has never modernized, that it never separated between church and state, that it has been incapable of understanding other civilizations. These are Lewis's reasons, but Huntington doesn't even bother with them. For him, Islam, Confucianism, and the other 5 or 6 civilizations that would include Hindu civilizations, Japanese, Slavic Orthodox, Latin American, and African, as well, of course, as the West. That all of these still exist and are separate from each other, and consequently potentially in a conflict which he wants to manage, not resolve. That's the point. He writes as a crisis manager, not as a student of civilization, nor as a reconciler between them. At the core of his essay, and this is what has made it strike so responsive a chord among post-Cold War policymakers, is this sense of cutting through a lot of unnecessary detail, of masses of scholarship and huge amounts of experience, and boiling all of them down to a couple of catchy, easy to quote and remember ideas, which are then passed off as pragmatic, practical, sensible, and clear. But is this the best way to understand the world we live in? Is it wise, as an intellectual and a scholarly expert, to produce a simplified map of the world that simply overlooks politics and history entirely? I mean, every member of a civilization is supposed to be intent only upon his civilization or her civilization, and doesn't think about, political parties, about struggles for power, about recent history, and all of that's irrelevant. The main thing is to fight the West, so Huntington used to say. And then takes this idea and hands it over to generals and civilian lawmakers as a prescription, first for comprehending and then for acting in the world. Doesn't this method, in effect, prolong and deepen conflict? What does it do to minimize civilizational conflict? Do we want the clash of civilizations? Is that really what we want in the end? And Huntington seems to think, yes, that is what we want. And doesn't this thesis mobilize nationalist passions and therefore nationalist murderousness? Shouldn't we ask the question, why is one doing this sort of thing? To understand or to act? To mitigate or to aggravate the likelihood of conflict? I would want to begin to survey the world situation by commenting on how prevalent it has become for people to speak out now in the name of large and, in my opinion, undesirably vague and manipulable abstractions like the West, or Japanese culture, or Slavic culture, or Islam, or Confucianism. Labels that collapse religions, races, and ethnicities into ideologies that are considerably more unpleasant and provocative than 19th century scholars like Gobineau and Renan did 150 years ago. Strange as it may seem, though, these examples which dot the media and even scholarly discourse today, these examples of group psychology run completely amok, are not new, and they're certainly not edifying at all. They occur in times of deep insecurity. That is, when people seem particularly close to and thrust upon each other, peoples of different civilizations. The result either of expansion, war, imperialism, or migration. I mean, if you think about France today, France is no longer made up exclusively of Frenchmen with names like Dupont and Chirac, for that matter. There are several hundred thousand, close to 2 million Muslims in France today. So you can't speak of France in the same old way. It's changed. And this sudden appearance of new nationalities, new identities in the midst of what used to be or was thought of as homogeneous identities produces an effect of sudden and unprecedented change. And this, of course, exacerbates the language of group identity. Let me give a couple of examples to illustrate what I mean from history. The language of group identity, when people start seriously to talk about themselves as French or British in a kind of aggravated, what we would call chauvinistic or even xenophobic way, makes its particularly strident appearance from the middle to the end of the 19th century as the culmination of decades of international competition between the great European and American powers for territories in Africa and Asia. In the battle for what Conrad called the empty spaces of Africa, the Dark Continent, France and Britain, as well as Germany and Belgium, resort not only to force, but to a whole slew of theories and rhetorics for justifying their plunder in Africa. Perhaps the most famous of such devices is the French concept of civilizing mission, mission civilisatrice, a notion underlying which is the idea that some races and cultures have a higher aim in life than others. This gives the more powerful, the more developed, the more civilized, the right, therefore, to colonize others, not in the name of brute force or raw plunder, both of which are standard components of the exercise, of course. That's why they were there in the first place. But in the name of a noble ideal. So you could do the killing, you could take the plunder, slave labor, etc. But at the same time say you're really doing it for their good because we have a mission to civilize the native. Conrad's most famous story, Heart of Darkness, is an ironic, even terrifying enactment of this thesis that, as his narrator Marlowe puts it, the conquest of the earth, which mostly means the taking it away from those who have who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. What redeems it is the idea. An idea at the back of it, not a sentimental pretense, but an idea. And an unselfish belief in the idea, something you can set up and bow down before and offer a sacrifice to. Now, in response to this kind of logic, two things occur. One is that competing powers, the French, the British, and the others, invent their own theory of cultural or civilizational destiny in order to justify their actions abroad and to distinguish themselves from the others who are doing the same thing. Britain had a theory like that, Germany had one, Belgium had one, and of course, in the concept of manifest destiny, the United States had one too, as an imperial power in the 19th century. These redeeming ideas dignify the practice of competition and clash, whose real purpose, as Conrad quite accurately saw, was power, conquest, self-aggrandizement, treasure, and unrestrained self-pride. I would go so far as to say that what we today call the rhetoric of identity, by which a member of one ethnic or religious or national or cultural group puts that group at the center of the world, derives from that period of imperial competition at the end of the 19th century. And this in turn provokes the concept of worlds at war, or civilizations at war, that quite obviously is the heart of Huntington's article. It received its most frightening application in H.G. Wells's fable, The War of the Worlds, which one recalls expands the concept to include a battle between this world and a distant interplanetary one. In the related fields of political economy, geography, anthropology, and historiography, the theory that each world is self-enclosed has its own boundaries and special territories applied to the world map, to the structure of civilizations, to the notion that each race and each civilization has a special destiny, has a special psychology, has a special ethos. All of these ideas, almost without exception, are based not on the harmony, but on the conflict or clash between worlds. You see it in the works of Gustave Le Bon, the French group psychologist, who wrote a famous book called The World in Revolt, and in such relatively forgotten works as F.S. Marvin's Western Races and the World, published in 1922, and in Pitt Rivers' The Clash of Culture and the Contact of Races, 1927. So this is all background to Huntington. The second thing that happens is that, as Huntington himself concedes, the lesser people, the people who are the objects of the imperial gaze, respond by resisting their forcible manipulation and settlement. We now know that active primary resistance to the white man began the moment he set foot in places like Algeria, East Africa, India, and elsewhere. Later, primary resistance, throwing spears, fighting battles, and so on, was succeeded by secondary resistance, the organization of political and cultural movements determined to achieve independence and liberation from imperial control. At precisely the moment in the 19th century that among the European and American powers, a rhetoric of civilizational self-justification begins to be widespread, a responding rhetoric among the colonized people develops, one that speaks in terms of African or Asian or Arab unity, independence, self-determination. In India, for example, the Congress Party was organized in 1880, and by the turn of the century had convinced the Indian elite that only by supporting Indian languages, Indian industry, Indian commerce, could political freedom come. These are ours and ours alone, runs the argument, and only by supporting our civilization against theirs, the British. Note the us versus them construction here. Only then can we stand firmly on our own. One finds a similar logic at work during the Meiji period in modern Japan. Something like this rhetoric of belonging is also lodged at the heart of each independence movement's nationalism, and it achieved the result shortly after World War II, not only of dismantling the classical empires, but of winning independence for dozens of countries thereafter. India, Indonesia, most of the Arab world, Indochina, Algeria, Kenya, all these emerged between 1945 and 1965 onto the world scene, sometimes peacefully, sometimes as the effect of internal developments, as in the Japanese instance, and as the result of ugly colonial wars, or wars as they were called, of national liberation. Now, in both the colonial and post-colonial context, therefore, rhetorics of general cultural or civilizational identity went in two potential directions. One, a utopian line that insisted on an overall pattern of integration and harmony between all peoples. No more empires, let us all be brothers and sisters together. First as Africans, then as Asians, then as citizens of the world community. That was one line. The other was a line that suggested as how all civilizations were so specific and jealous, monotheistic in effect, as to reject and war against all the others. Among instances of the first, or utopian, line are the language and the institutions of the United Nations, founded in the aftermath of World War II. We're celebrating the 50th anniversary of that institution today. And the subsequent development out of that of various attempts at world government predicated on coexistence, voluntary limitations of sovereignty, integration of peoples and cultures harmoniously. Among the second are the theory and practice of the Cold War. And more recently, the idea that the clash of civilizations is, if not a necessity for a world of so many different parts, then a certainty. That's Huntington. According to this, cultures and civilizations are basically separated from each other. I don't want to be invidious here and to just talk only about attitudes like Huntington's in the West, because in the Islamic world, for example, there's been a resurgence of rhetorics and movements stressing the inimicability of Islam with the West. Just as in Africa, Europe, Asia, movements have appeared that stress the need for excluding designated others as undesirable. Former Yugoslavia is a landscape of desolation as a result of that kind of logic. White apartheid in South Africa was such a movement too. The point of this short cultural history of the idea of the clash of civilizations is that people like Huntington are products of that history and are shaped in their writings by it. Moreover, the language describing the clash is laced with considerations of power. The powerful use it to protect what they have, what they do. The powerless or less powerful use it to achieve parity, independence, or a comparative advantage with regard to the dominant power. Thus, to build a conceptual framework around the notion of us versus them is in effect to pretend that the principal consideration is epistemological and natural. Our civilization is known and accepted, theirs is different and strange. Whereas in fact, I would want to argue the framework separating us from them is constructed, is situational, is belligerent, is designed to prolong conflict. Within each civilizational camp, we will notice, there are official representatives of the culture or civilization who make themselves into its mouthpiece. You know, people like William Bennett, who's going around telling us what our virtues really are. I mean, I didn't vote for Bennett, I didn't appoint him to that, but that function seems to exist now, proliferating as a function within cultures and countries.